I still remember the smell of the laboratories. That mix of isopropyl alcohol, stale coffee, and dreams far too big to fit inside a test tube. I was Emily Walker, Ph.D. in biotechnology, full-time researcher, and deeply in love with my husband, Andrew Mitchell, heir to Mitchell Pharma, one of the largest and most influential pharmaceutical companies in the United States. When I looked at Andrew's face, I saw the future. A house full of books and children, scientific trips, awards, maybe even a Nobel. Everything seemed possible. To the world, we were the perfect couple. The brilliant and relentless mind who wanted to revolutionize medicine, and the businessman who, despite being born into wealth, had never lost his warmth. Our connection was almost surreal. He used to call me his lab light, teasing me about the way I lit up when immersed in research. And I laughed. I laughed because I felt safe. I laughed because I was happy. But as I would later learn, the hardest way, safety and happiness are fragile. Sometimes, all it takes is a well-spun lie, a misdirected gaze, and trusting the wrong people. In our case, the poison came from within. Jason Reed, Andrew's best friend since childhood, and his sister, Madeline Reed. Jason was the charming type, magnetic. The kind of man who walks into a room and makes it feel like the world revolves around him. It was hard not to like him. Maybe that was our mistake. He held an important role at the company, too, chief operating officer, and he made sure to be involved in every decision. As for Madeline, she was stunning, refined, but cold as a New England winter. And for reasons I couldn't understand at the time, she didn't like me from day one. The betrayal began with small things. Files that vanished from my desk. Whispers during board meetings. One of my key research projects shelved due to budget concerns. I thought it was resistance to change, maybe jealousy. But I had no idea what they were planning behind closed doors. And then one day, everything crumbled. Andrew came home early. His eyes were red, jaw clenched, holding a manila envelope. He threw it on the coffee table and out spilled photographs. Photos of me, supposedly, in a hotel room with a man I had never seen before. Alongside them were faked audio recordings of phone calls, fabricated text conversations. Everything meticulously crafted. And he believed it. "I never thought you were capable of this, Emily." His voice trembled. "After everything we built, you destroyed it all." I tried to explain. I begged him to look into my eyes and listen. But he wouldn't. His pain was louder than my truth. Before I could even breathe, I was out the door with a suitcase and a shattered heart. In that moment, I didn't know what hurt more, losing the man I loved or realizing that he didn't even hesitate to believe the worst of me. I went from the top to rock bottom in a matter of days. And as if the emotional wreckage wasn't enough, the media devoured me alive. Headlines painted me as the scientific seductress who had betrayed one of America's most promising heirs. Universities where I had lectured wouldn't even return my emails. Doors closed one by one. My career, my name, everything I had worked for was burned down in less than a week. Then came the discovery. I was staying in a damp basement apartment, renting from an elderly woman, when I started getting nauseous. I thought it was stress. But the test result was crystal clear. I was pregnant. With twins. I sat on the bathroom floor, holding the paper with trembling hands. Part of me wanted to scream. Another part wanted to cry. But something inside me simply went still. As if, in that silence, a new purpose began to form. Not just survival, but rebirth. That was when Margaret Sullivan came into my life. A kind widow who lived in an old house in a quiet neighborhood. I met her by accident. I had gone to the wrong address looking for a letter. She invited me in for tea, and by sunset, I was telling her everything, as if she were my grandmother. She didn't judge me. She just listened. The next day, she offered me a room in her home, rent-free. "You have the eyes of someone who's meant to do great things, sweetheart," she said. "But first, you need a home." In Margaret's home, I found peace again. Slowly, I began to breathe. My belly grew, and with it, a strength I didn't know I had. One warm summer afternoon, I made myself a promise. I will prove the truth. But more than that, I will build something so powerful that no lie will ever be able to erase me again. I didn't know how. Not yet. But one thing was certain. Emily Walker would not be erased. I would come back, for me, for my children, and for everything that had been unjustly taken from me. The twins were born on a rainy autumn morning. I still remember the sound of the wind pressing against the windows, as if the world outside wanted to remind me that nothing would ever be the same again. I held them for the first time with trembling arms, tears slipping down my cheeks, but this time they weren't from pain or fear. They were from awe, from love, from that sudden, overwhelming certainty that my life had just been rewritten, and this time, I was the one holding the pen. I named them Ethan and Lily. Ethan, because it meant strong, and that was what I wished for him in a world where truth could be buried by money and manipulation. And Lily, for the flower that blooms quietly, yet resiliently, even after the harshest winters. They were perfect. They had Andrew's eyes, that calm ocean blue, and my dark hair. And every time I looked at them, I felt the ache of betrayal and loss lessen, just a little. Margaret became more than a landlady. She became their grandmother in every way that mattered. She would sit in her rocking chair, humming lullabies while feeding them bottles, whispering stories about her late husband and her garden that used to win ribbons at the state fair. Her kindness wrapped around us like a warm quilt, and in those early months, that gentle consistency was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. But I couldn't stay hidden forever. Every time I saw a scientific journal arrive in the mail, or a news headline about a new pharmaceutical patent, I felt something stir inside me, something equal parts fire and sorrow. The field I had dedicated my life to was still evolving, still being shaped, and I had something to offer it. No matter how much Jason and Madeline had tried to destroy me, they hadn't taken the one thing that truly mattered, my mind. So, I started working again. At first, it was just late at night, once the twins were asleep. I dusted off my old laptop, pulled out notebooks from my grad school days, and began scribbling formulas, ideas, chemical combinations. I read papers, built models, even started coding again. And as I worked, something miraculous happened. The pieces of me that had shattered slowly started fitting back together. One evening, while I was sketching out a new drug delivery system based on nanocapsules derived from plant proteins, Margaret peeked into the room and said, "You know, my niece Lauren works in medicine. She's a pediatric researcher, actually. I bet she'd love what you're doing." That's how I met Dr. Lauren Bennett, brilliant, driven, and as idealistic as I had once been. She came over the following Sunday with a pie and a dozen questions. She listened to my pitch, my theories, my goals for a pharmaceutical company that wasn't ruled by greed, but by purpose. And she didn't laugh. She didn't doubt me. She leaned forward, smiled, and said, "Emily, let's build this together." That was the moment BioNova was born. We started small, out of Margaret's garage, believe it or not. Ethan and Lily would play with blocks on the carpet while Lauren and I brainstormed formulations. She brought in 2 of her former classmates, and I reached out to a few international contacts who still believed in my integrity. One by one, we pieced together a team. We weren't just creating medicine. We were rewriting the rules. No patent hoarding. No overpriced life-saving treatments. No partnerships with shady conglomerates. BioNova was going to be the kind of company I had once dreamed Mitchell Pharma could be. We focused on biotechnology for underserved communities, pediatric care, and long-term therapeutic solutions. And in less than 3 years, our first product, a revolutionary, plant-based insulin patch, received global recognition. We were invited to speak at conferences. Articles began to circulate. The scientific community that had turned its back on me slowly started to take notice again. Not because of my past, but because of what we were doing in the present. And then the unthinkable happened. I received a letter. Thick cream-colored stationery with the Mitchell Pharma seal pressed into the envelope. Inside was an invitation to Andrew's wedding. To their wedding. He was marrying Madeline Reed. I sat frozen at the kitchen table, staring at the invitation like it was a ghost from another life. Margaret, bless her heart, read it over my shoulder and said, "Well, if that ain't the universe daring you to show up." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel broken when I thought of Andrew. I felt clear. I felt calm. Because I finally had the power he had taken from me, not by returning to the past, but by standing tall in my own future. I folded the invitation carefully and slid it into my drawer. Then I turned to Margaret and said, "We're going, but not as guests." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" I smiled, a quiet, steady smile. "I mean it's time they see exactly what they tried to destroy, and how I've built something even stronger." And with that, the plan began to take shape. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with a kind of electric energy I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't bitterness. No, I had made peace with the past. It was something deeper. A quiet, focused strength. A sense that everything I had endured was about to come full circle. That the truth I carried, not just about what had been done to me, but what I had built in the aftermath, deserved to be seen. Lauren was the first person I told about the plan. I showed her the invitation and said, "I want to go, but I don't want to just attend. I want to make a statement." She didn't even blink. "Then we make one. You'll arrive not as a forgotten scientist or some woman scorned, but as the founder of BioNova, with a legacy in your arms." That's when the idea came. Not a press release. Not a court battle. No dramatic confrontation in a hallway. But something elegant. Symbolic. Unforgettable. The event was to be held at the Mitchell estate, in the garden where Andrew and I once talked about growing old together. The same place where, under a canopy of white roses, he had promised me forever. The irony was sharp, but I no longer flinched at the memories. I had replaced them with better ones. The sound of my children laughing, the late-night research sessions with Lauren, the first time I saw the BioNova logo printed on a shipping box. 2 days before the wedding, I made a phone call. It wasn't to Andrew, or to the press. It was to Raymond Lin, a longtime journalist who once interviewed me at a global science forum. He had believed in my research before anyone else. He picked up on the second ring. "Emily Walker," he said with surprise. "Is this really you?" "I have a story to tell," I said. "And I want you to be there when I do." He didn't ask questions. He simply replied, "Send me the time and place." The morning of the wedding arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the windows. Margaret helped dress Ethan and Lily in matching outfits, navy and white, polished but playful. They were 5 now, curious, vibrant, full of questions and wonder. As I zipped up my dress, a deep emerald green suit dress tailored with clean lines and elegance, I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone new. I didn't see the woman who had been broken. I saw a founder, a mother, a force. And I was ready. The helicopter arrived right on schedule. Yes, a helicopter. Not for the drama, but because I wanted to make it clear I had risen, literally and figuratively. BioNova had recently partnered with an international nonprofit for emergency medical transport in rural areas. This aircraft was one of ours, branded, ethical, purposeful, just like everything I stood for. The rotors cut through the sky as we approached the estate. From above, I could see the guests milling around in the garden, champagne glasses glinting in the sun, white tents, string lights, photographers snapping shots of what was meant to be a perfect, polished society wedding. We landed at the far edge of the property, on the private helipad once reserved for Andrew's business meetings. As we stepped out, me, Ethan, Lily, and Lauren, the wind carried the sound of gasps across the lawn. People turned. Some froze. Others whispered. And then Andrew appeared. He looked older.
Worn.
Still handsome, yes, but the sparkle he once had, the one that lit up when we talked science, when we dreamed together, it wasn't there. He stared at me like he was seeing a ghost. And then his eyes dropped to Ethan and Lily. The resemblance was undeniable. His breath caught in his throat. "Emily," he asked, barely audible. I didn't answer him.
Not yet.
Instead, I walked toward the stage where the microphone stood, flanked by florals and golden silk. The ceremony hadn't started yet.
Perfect.
I stepped up, took the mic, and, with the calm of someone who had walked through fire and come out gold, I began. My name is Emily Walker.
Some of you know me as a scientist.
Others may remember headlines that painted me as something I never was. But today, I am here not to revisit the past, but to reveal the truth and offer a future. The crowd was silent. Even the birds in the trees seemed to pause. I told them everything. About the fabricated evidence, the betrayal, the pregnancy, the fall, and the rise. I introduced BioNova, explained our mission, and how we had developed treatments that saved lives without exploiting them. I spoke of the power of science guided by conscience. And then finally, I looked directly at Andrew. "These children," I said, placing my hands on Ethan and Lily's shoulders, "are yours. And they deserve to know their father, not as a man blinded by lies, but as someone brave enough to see the truth now." Madeline stood to the side, face pale, lips pressed in a tight line. Jason, who had remained behind the scenes, tried to step forward, but Raymond Lynn, now recording everything, turned the camera toward him. The crowd followed. People began whispering again, this time with disgust, not curiosity. I turned back to Andrew. "And I'm not here to take revenge. I'm here to propose a choice. A pause. A merger. Between BioNova and Mitchell Pharma. A true alliance. One built on ethics, innovation, and transparency. We don't have to erase the past, but we can write the future."
He didn't speak.
Not yet. But his eyes were filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Recognition. Respect. Regret. And maybe, just maybe, hope. There was a stillness in the air after I finished speaking, the kind of silence that carries weight. No one moved. No one clapped. It was as if the truth had landed like a stone in the center of a glass table, sending cracks in every direction. I looked around and saw faces frozen in disbelief. Eyes darting from Andrew to Madeline, then back to me. And then, slowly, as if waking from a trance, the murmurs began. I stepped down from the stage, my heart steady. Ethan clung gently to my hand, and Lily, ever the more fearless twin, looked around as if she could sense the shift in the atmosphere, even if she didn't fully understand it. Lauren joined me, standing as tall and proud as ever. And Margaret, who had stayed in the background, gave me the smallest of nods, the kind that says you did it. Andrew was still staring at me, his expression unreadable. I expected anger, maybe indignation. But instead, what I saw in his face was something far more powerful, sorrow. Not the kind that begs for forgiveness, but the kind that realizes, all at once, what has been lost.
He
walked toward me slowly, ignoring the cameras, the guests, the confusion rippling through his own wedding. When he stopped just a few feet away, his voice was low. "They're mine?" I nodded.
Yes.
They always were. He closed his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" My response was quiet but firm. "You didn't give me the chance." That truth stung him. I saw it in the way his shoulders dropped, the breath he had to force out. It would have been easy to unleash my pain in that moment, to throw back every ounce of humiliation and heartbreak he had caused. But I didn't, because I wasn't there to punish him. I was there to free myself. Madeline stepped forward then, trying to maintain the composure of a woman who still believed she was in control. "This is a private event," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension. "You've made your spectacle, Emily. Now, please leave. But before I could answer, Andrew turned to her, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw steel in his gaze when he looked at her. Madeline, he said, voice calm but unyielding. We're going to talk later. Privately. She blinked. Andrew. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply said, not now. The shift was visible.
The air changed.
Guests who moments before had smiled politely at Madeline were now taking a step back. The mask was cracking. Jason tried to slip out unnoticed, but Raymond Lynn, ever the sharp observer, called out, Mr. Reed, would you like to comment on the fraudulent evidence you submitted years ago? We're live, by the way. Jason froze. And just like that, the narrative, the one they had so carefully built against me, collapsed. No longer was I the disgraced wife. I was the mother of Andrew's children, the founder of BioNova, the woman who had survived, thrived, and returned on her own terms. Later that afternoon, after most of the guests had quietly dispersed and the ceremony had been indefinitely postponed, Andrew asked to speak with me alone. We walked through the garden paths we once loved, and for the first time in over 5 years, we spoke without the weight of lies pressing between us. I don't expect your forgiveness, he said. But I was wrong. I see that now. I looked at him. It's not about forgiveness, Andrew. It's about truth.
And choice.
What we do with what's left. He nodded slowly. And the merger, is that offer real? Absolutely. Not because I owe you anything, but because your family's company was once built on good intentions. I think together, we can restore that, not for us, but for the generations after us.
We shook hands.
It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It was respectful. And somehow, that felt more powerful than anything else. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Andrew stepped back from his role temporarily to conduct a full internal audit. Madeline and Jason were suspended pending legal investigation, with overwhelming evidence compiled by Raymond and a few tech experts who volunteered to help us after the story broke. The public response to BioNova's mission was overwhelming. Donations, offers, support from across the globe. But more than that, there was trust. We became a symbol, not just of innovation, but of resilience, of rebuilding something better from the ruins of betrayal. And in the middle of it all, Ethan and Lily reminded me why I had done any of it in the first place. One night, as I tucked them into bed, Ethan looked at me with those same calm ocean blue eyes and asked, Mom, were you scared when we landed at the wedding? I smiled. A little. But you looked really brave. I kissed his forehead. Being brave doesn't mean you're never scared, sweetheart. It just means you do the right thing, even when it's hard. And as I turned out the light, I knew something with absolute clarity. I had reclaimed my life. Not by fighting fire with fire, but by becoming a flame of my own. A flame that no wind could ever put out again. The months that followed felt like the sunrise after a long, relentless storm. Every day brought a new challenge, yes, but also a new sense of purpose. I wasn't just rebuilding my reputation. I was redefining what it meant to be a woman in science, a mother, a leader, and most of all, a survivor who refused to be quietly erased. The merger between BioNova and Mitchell Pharma was a monumental move, one that required careful planning, legal transparency, and hours upon hours of negotiation. But the moment the documents were signed, I felt a shift in the ground beneath me. Not because I had won. This was never about revenge. It was about correcting the narrative and using the very system that tried to break me to now build something better. Andrew and I became co-chairs of the new board, though our roles were clearly defined. He handled business relations, legacy accounts, and public rebranding, while I focused on innovation, research, and community outreach. We weren't friends, not yet, but we had learned to communicate with respect.
And that was enough.
One afternoon, during a strategy meeting, he pulled me aside and said something I didn't expect. You were always the one meant to lead this, Emily. I was just keeping the seat warm. I didn't know what to say at first. Not because I needed his validation, but because I finally realized he meant it. There was no jealousy in his tone, just recognition. And that made all the difference. The new company, which we decided to call Nova Mitchell, launched its first joint initiative 6 weeks later, a nationwide campaign to provide free insulin to low-income families, made possible by our patented plant-based patches. It was a dream I once scribbled on a napkin in my grad school dorm room, and now it was a living, breathing reality. Media coverage was massive. Not just because of the science, though that was impressive on its own, but because of the story behind it. I had become, somehow, a symbol. And that terrified me more than it flattered me. You see, I never wanted to be a headline. I wanted to be a mother who tucked her children in at night and a scientist who made molecules dance in harmony. But I learned that sometimes the story chooses you. And when it does, you have two choices: shrink back or stand tall. I chose the latter. And then came Michael. Dr. Michael Hayes was a pediatric surgeon we met during a panel on collaborative healthcare. Lauren had introduced us, thinking we might find common ground professionally. She had no idea how right she was. Michael had the kind of calm presence that made people lean in without realizing it. He asked questions not to challenge me, but because he genuinely wanted to understand how things worked, in the lab, in life, and eventually in my heart. At first I resisted. Not because I didn't like him. I did, far more than I wanted to admit. But I was afraid. I had spent so many years building walls that the thought of letting someone in again felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Michael never rushed me. Instead, he showed up with patience, with small acts of kindness. He'd bring Lily her favorite strawberry smoothies after appointments. He'd ask Ethan about his fascination with space, even bringing him a telescope one evening. And when we talked, he saw me, not the media version, not the woman with a scandalous past, but the human being beneath it all. One night, after a long charity gala where we had both spoken, he offered me a ride home. As we sat in the car outside Margaret's house, he turned to me and said, "You don't have to be ready for anything more, Emily. I just want to be part of your world, in whatever way you're willing to let me." And somehow, in that quiet moment, with no grand gestures, no fireworks, I felt something open inside me. A door I hadn't even realized I had locked so tightly. I smiled. "You're already in it." We started slow. Dinner with the kids. Walks in the park. Scientific banter that turned into laughter. Michael never tried to compete with my past. He simply became part of my present. And in doing so, helped me imagine a different kind of future. Ethan and Lily adored him. Margaret watched from the porch like a proud guardian angel, always smiling but never interfering. Lauren, always my compass, said, "He's the chapter you didn't know you deserved." And she was right. By the time winter arrived, Nova Mitchell had expanded into 3 new countries. Our research on antibiotic-resistant treatments had been nominated for a Global Innovation Prize. And at home, the twins had written a family tree for their school project. I found it taped to the refrigerator one morning. At the center, beneath a carefully drawn heart, were 3 names: Mom, Ethan, Lily. And beside them, a 4th name written in smaller, shy letters: Michael. I didn't cry. Not exactly. But I stood there a long time, hand on my chest, overwhelmed by how far we had come. Not just from betrayal to truth. Not just from loss to success. But from fear to love. Spring arrived early that year, as if nature itself had decided to mirror the new season blooming in my life. The cherry blossoms in Margaret's garden bloomed brighter than I remembered, and the scent of lavender drifted through the open windows as the twins played outside, their laughter echoing across the yard like music. It was a season of reflection, a season of becoming. Each morning, I would sip my tea by the window and think about how different everything looked now, not just the world around me, but the woman staring back in the reflection. There was grace in her now. Not the kind that comes from ease, but the kind earned through storms. Through rising. Through letting go without forgetting. I still remembered the nights I cried myself to sleep, the days I was too ashamed to leave the house, the time I almost gave up entirely. But those memories didn't hurt the way they used to. They had transformed into quiet milestones, markers on a journey that had brought me here, to love, to purpose, to healing. Nova Mitchell continued to grow in ways we had only dreamed of. We launched mobile labs across underserved communities, partnered with women-led initiatives, and even opened our first international research center in Nairobi. At every launch event, I saw young girls watching me with wide eyes, curious, hopeful, daring to imagine themselves in lab coats one day. That more than any award or title moved me the most. And yet, amid all the celebration and innovation, life remained beautifully ordinary too. Ethan developed a love for astronomy and asked endless questions about stars and black holes. Lily became obsessed with painting, leaving trails of color wherever she went. On paper, the kitchen floor, even her brother's forehead once. Margaret remained our anchor, baking pies on Sundays, and always knowing when I needed a hug before I even asked. And Michael had become the calm center of my universe. He never tried to save me. He never tried to fix what had already healed. Instead, he walked beside me, listened, learned the rhythms of my life, and wove himself into them gently. Our love didn't arrive with lightning. It arrived like morning light, soft, steady, undeniable. One evening, as the kids were getting ready for bed, Michael and I stood in the hallway, talking about a conference we'd both been invited to attend in Boston. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked suddenly. "About what?" "Everything that had to happen to bring us here." I paused. "Every single day." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. "I'm glad you didn't let it break you." "I did break," I whispered. "But I learned how to put myself back together differently. Stronger." And it was true. I wasn't the same Emily who once trembled in fear as the world turned against her. I was something else now, softer, perhaps, but braver too. Because I had faced the fire and walked through it carrying 2 children, a dream, and a belief in something bigger than revenge. Renewal. That night, I sat by my desk, watching the kids sleep through the baby monitor, and began writing a letter. Not for the public. Not for the press. Just for me. It started simply. "Dear Emily, you did it. You didn't just survive, you became. And in doing so, you gave others the courage to become too." The letter turned into a reflection, a memory, a promise. I printed it and folded it into a small envelope, labeling it "For the next time you doubt yourself." I kept it in my drawer, next to the invitation from Andrew and Madeline's wedding, 2 pieces of paper, representing 2 ends of the same journey. I was no longer angry. I no longer wanted apologies. I had something better. Truth, love, and freedom. And then something happened that I never expected. A letter arrived in the mail, hand-addressed, no return name. Inside was a short note, trembling handwriting. "Emily, I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I hope, one day, you'll know how sorry I am. Andrew." I sat for a long time with that letter in my hands. Not because I didn't know what to feel, but because I knew exactly what I felt. Peace. I folded the note and placed it beside the others. Another artifact from a life that had shifted, reshaped, and bloomed again. Because healing doesn't always look like closure. Sometimes, it looks like quiet mornings, fresh notebooks, children's drawings on the fridge, and a hand to hold when you least expect it. And that was more than enough. One of the most beautiful truths I've come to accept is that life rarely gives us back what we lost. It gives us something else. Something we never imagined we needed. And for me, that something came in the form of possibility. I no longer clung to what had been. I had stopped hoping for apologies that never came, or for justice to arrive in the way I once dreamed it would. What mattered now were the things I could build with my own hands, and the hearts I could impact along the way. That's why, when Nova Mitchell received a letter from a small town in West Virginia, a request to fund a mobile medical clinic, I didn't just send money. I packed a bag. It had been years since I had taken a personal trip for work, but something about that letter, the handwriting of the school nurse who wrote it, the urgency in her voice, the plea to help children who had never seen a pediatrician, it moved something deep inside me. Michael offered to go with me, but I told him I needed to do this one alone. He understood without question. That's the kind of love we had grown into, one that respected space just as much as closeness. I arrived on a windy afternoon, greeted by the nurse, Carol, who hugged me like I was her long-lost sister. "I didn't think you'd actually come," she whispered, her voice cracking. I smiled. Of course I did. Children's health isn't just a mission statement. It's personal. The next 48 hours were unlike anything I'd experienced in a long time. We examined over 200 children. Many of them had never had basic vaccines. Some had undiagnosed conditions that broke my heart. But there was laughter too. And crayons. And a little girl named Harper who clung to my arm and said, "When I grow up, I want to be a doctor like you, Miss Emily." That night, back at the small inn where I stayed, I looked out over the dark, quiet hills and cried. Not from sadness, from gratitude. Because this was purpose. Not fancy events. Not polished speeches, but human-to-human care. The kind that doesn't fit into press releases, but leaves marks on your soul. When I returned home, Lily and Ethan came running into my arms like I'd been gone for years. Margaret had baked a pie, of course, and Michael had made sure their homework was finished and their backpacks organized by the front door. Life had become our kind of normal, one that felt soft, steady, and full of intention. One evening, a few weeks later, we held a celebration at Nova Mitchell headquarters. It was 5 years since BioNova had been born, 5 years since I had started again. We filled the hall with photos of our journey, research milestones, patient stories, team retreats, and even a few candid shots of the kids drawing molecules in crayon. The final speech of the night was mine. As I stood on the stage, looking out at a sea of faces, my team, my family, my children sitting proudly in the front row, I felt the words come not from a script, but from the deepest part of who I had become. I stand here today not as someone who avoided pain, I began, but as someone who walked through it and found something more on the other side, not just success, but truth and clarity and community. BioNova was never just a company.
It was a response to injustice.
And now, Nova Mitchell stands as a promise that we can do better. That science can be guided by empathy, not ego. That healing is not only about medicine but about people. The applause was thunderous. Not because the words were grand, but because they were real. And in a world where so much is curated, realness cuts through like light through fog. After the event, as I helped Ethan with his tie and Lily practiced curtsying for fun, Michael walked up behind me and whispered, "I've never been more proud to love someone." I turned to him, eyes misty. "I never imagined this life." He smiled. "That's what makes it so beautiful." We drove home that night in quiet laughter, the kind that flows freely when you know you're exactly where you're meant to be. The city lights blurred outside the windows, and the kids dozed in the back seat, heads leaning together, dreams softly blooming in their minds. I looked out at the skyline, the same one that once watched me fall apart. And now, it watched me rise. Not with vengeance, not with noise, but with grace. Because I had learned that the most powerful stories aren't the ones where the heroine is rescued. They're the ones where she saves herself, then turns around and builds something that lifts others too. And that's exactly what I intended to keep doing. One heartbeat at a time. By the time summer settled over the city with its long golden evenings and warm breezes, life had found its rhythm, a tempo I never expected but had grown to love with every fiber of my being. The twins were now 6, full of questions and opinions about everything. Lily insisted she was going to be both an artist and a science queen, and Ethan had started drawing rocket designs in his notebook, claiming he would one day send medicine to space. Michael joked that we might have a space station staffed entirely by our family. But secretly, I believed it wasn't too far-fetched. At Nova Mitchell, things continued to flourish, but I was careful, intentional, even about the direction we were heading. Growth wasn't our goal. Impact was. I had learned, from the ruins of my past, that scale without soul was dangerous. So, we kept our values sharp and non-negotiable: transparency, accessibility, innovation, and heart. One morning, during a board meeting, Andrew and I presented a proposal that would mark a new chapter, a mentorship initiative for young women in science, especially those from marginalized communities. We called it the Walker Initiative, his idea, not mine. When he proposed the name, I hesitated. "Andrew, are you sure?" He looked at me with sincerity. "It's your legacy. It always was. I want the world to remember not just the company you built, but the way you never let the world silence you." That conversation stayed with me. Not because it healed everything between us. Some wounds, even when closed, leave a scar. But because it marked something rare and real: mutual respect. There was no romance. No revisionist fairy tale. Just two people who had failed each other once and now stood on equal ground, trying to leave something better behind. Later that week, I received an unexpected message from Jason Reed's lawyer. It was a formal apology, dictated by the court, no doubt, admitting to the fabrication of evidence, manipulation, and slander. He had agreed to a settlement. I would never see him again. The chapter, officially, was closed. I read the document once. Then I placed it in the same drawer as Andrew's letter and the folded napkin with BioNova's original sketch. Not out of sentimentality, but because I had learned something vital. The past belongs in its place. Not forgotten, but not allowed to define you either. That weekend, we held a small celebration at home, not for anything in particular, just for us. Michael grilled on the patio. The kids ran through the sprinklers, soaking their clothes and screaming with laughter. Margaret sat in her usual chair, a glass of lemonade in hand, watching everything like a matriarch overseeing her kingdom. At one point, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Michael walked over, took my hand, and said, "Come with me." We slipped away quietly, walking down the block to a small garden tucked between buildings. Fireflies danced in the fading light, and the world felt hushed and soft. He turned to me. "Emily, I've loved you quietly, completely, and without condition. I've watched you rebuild your world piece by piece, not for me, not for the world, but for yourself. And I admire that more than I can say." My heart beat faster, but I stayed still. "I'm not asking you to forget the past. I'm asking if we can write the future. Together." There was no ring, no crowd, no grand stage. Just two people standing in a garden, and a love that had grown gently, patiently, without ever demanding space it hadn't earned. I smiled through tears.
Yes.
Yes, we can. That night, I wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done in months. My handwriting was slower now, more thoughtful. Today, I said yes. Not to a
man,
but to this life. To a life I built. A life full of truth and laughter and resilience. I am no longer the woman who was exiled by lies. I am the woman who created a home, a company, and a future, all from the ashes. Later, I kissed my children goodnight, listened to the soft breathing of a home at peace, and felt something settle inside me. Not an end, not a climax, just peace. And in that quiet, I realized something even more powerful than the revenge I once craved or the success I thought I needed. I was happy. Truly, deeply, quietly happy. And after everything I had survived, that was the greatest victory of all. A year later, I stood in front of a packed auditorium at the National Science and Ethics Conference in Washington, D.C. I had been invited to deliver the keynote address, not just as a scientist or a CEO, but as someone who had navigated the intersection of innovation, personal truth, and redemption. As I looked across the sea of faces, young researchers, seasoned professionals, students scribbling notes in the margins of their programs, I took a moment to breathe. To remember, there had been a time I thought I would never stand behind a podium again, that my voice would remain muted by the weight of falsehoods and betrayal. But here I was, not just speaking but being heard. I open with a story, not about molecules or mergers, but about a moment most people never knew. I remember sitting on a cold bathroom floor, holding a piece of paper that told me I was going to be a mother, alone, unemployed, humiliated, and falsely accused. I remember thinking, this is where it ends. But it wasn't. It was where I began. The room was silent, the kind of silence that says, we're with you. I talked about BioNova, about Nova Mitchell, about using science not just to solve problems, but to heal systems. I spoke of accessibility, of empathy, of the responsibility that comes with knowledge. And then I shared something I had never shared publicly before, the truth about Andrew, Jason, Madeline, and the path that brought me to where I was. Not out of bitterness, but out of belief that the truth, even when painful, has the power to set more than just one person free. When I finished, the applause was long, not thunderous, but full of warmth. A standing ovation, not because I was extraordinary, but because I had survived and grown. And perhaps, in some small way, because my story gave others permission to do the same. Afterward, as I stepped off the stage, a young woman approached me. She had tears in her eyes and a notebook pressed to her chest. I was going to drop out of my Ph.D., she said. But hearing you, I won't. I hugged her without hesitation. That was the power of stories. Not to impress, but to ignite. Back home, life continued with the same beautiful rhythm it always had. The kids were thriving. Ethan had joined the school's science club and recently gave a presentation on plant-based medicine. Lily was designing a series of illustrated books about women in science and had asked if she could name the lead character, Dr. Walker. I told her she could name her anything she liked, but I said with a wink, Dr. Walker has a pretty good ring to it. Margaret, though older now, still baked every Sunday. Her pies were a tradition that not even time dared to interrupt. Michael had taken on a new role at a children's hospital, leading a multidisciplinary team focused on rare pediatric conditions, and I couldn't have been prouder. We never rushed into marriage. There was no pressure. No need to prove anything. We were building something stronger, a life rooted in quiet loyalty, in knowing glances, in being each other's peace. We shared a home, a love, and a vision for the world we wanted to leave behind. On the anniversary of BioNova's founding, we held a private event at the original garage, the same place where it all started. We hung old photos, displayed sketches, read aloud journal entries from the early days, including the napkin Lauren and I had scribbled our first ideas on. She was there too, of course, still my partner in science and sister in soul. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I gave one last toast. To truth. To second chances. To rising when no one expects you to. And to the kind of love that meets you not at your peak, but in your healing. Everyone raised their glasses. Even the children clinked their little juice cups, giggling. And in that golden hour light, I saw everything I had ever dreamed of, not in the perfection of a plan, but in the completion of a journey. I am Emily Walker.
Scientist.
Mother. Survivor. Builder. I was once brought down by lies. But I stood back up with truth, and I carried more than just my name forward. I carried a legacy, a future, and a love that finally felt like home.